622 is the beginning of the period when Muhammad decided to switch his tactic, I guess you could say, from just preaching religion to jihad. Jihad properly means struggle, and I have a very interesting thing here, which I obtained. This is a rather popular book in the Muslim world and the Arab world, and struggle in German, Kampf, means the same thing as it does in Arabic, jihad.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast today. It's great to have you with us on Keeping It Israel. My guest today is Ben Poser. He's the executive editor of White Rose Magazine, a publication named after Sophie and Hans Scholl's anti-Nazi pamphlet movement. His articles have appeared in the Allgemeiner, JNS, the Jerusalem Post, and Tablet, and he's been interviewed on JNS TV and Frank Gaffney's Securing America podcast. His main areas of research are anti-Semitism and Islam, and he holds a degree in classical archaeology and ancient history from Brandeis University. It is a pleasure, Ben, to have you with us. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
Well, we want to know, first of all, who's Ben Poser? Tell us a bit about yourself. What's your background? Where'd you grow up? And how did you get involved in White Rose Magazine?
Well, I grew up in Boston. And I was always interested in history. I think you think about what interests you as a kid, and you're not sure because you're a kid and you're still learning what using your brain is. And you've all these things and you got to coalesce together. But I was always interested in history, and a wonderful parenting decision my parents made was to buy me all kinds of educational videos. Back then it was VHS. I still know what a VHS is, trust me. National Geographic and Nova and things like that. And so I learned a lot about history, and it just interested me. And I was an only child. I didn't have a lot of friends. So kind of my escape was into, my traveling was learning. And my maternal grandfather, of blessed memory, he knew a fellow named Charles Jacobs, who runs something called Americans for Peace and Tolerance. That's the 501c3, and then there are other projects which have branched off of that. Most recently, the Jewish Leadership Project. When I graduated from Brandeis in 2016, I needed an internship, and so I spoke to my grandfather, and he spoke to Charles. Charles Jacobs has been on your podcast before. And I worked for him ever since, through whether it's loyalty, lack of ambition, or something more virtuous than that. I got interested in Israel and anti-Semitism when I was a little bit younger, because 15 years ago, I went on a trip to Israel, which my grandfather's foundation sponsored. My grandfather's name was Bob Lappin, and he had a foundation on the North Shore of Massachusetts called the Lappin Foundation. And one of the things, it was an educational charity, and one of the things it did was it raised money from the Jewish community in the area to send teenagers from the area. I didn't live in that area, but I was part of the family, to Israel for free, for the purposes of the family, for your kid's family. And I went in 2010. I think it changed my life a lot more as I look back. I don't know how much it changed my life when I got back home. I think it was, I was there for 12 days. I think maybe on July 18th or something I got home. Looking back, I think it was an extraordinary experience, because I'd heard about Israel. I didn't grow up religious, but I'd heard about Israel. He talked about Israel, and this thing was real for me. And I knew what the country looked like, and I knew what the olive tree smelled like. I was at the wall. Had tefillin put on me by guys at the Kotel, and I saw Herzl's grave, and I went to Yad Vashem, and I saw the sun rise over Metzada, the Yam HaMelech of the Dead Sea. I just knew something was different in my life, and it wasn't necessarily a religious thing at the time when I was 16 years old, but it was an important thing. And so I kind of just by accident, I just, without really being religious, and I've gotten more religious over the years, I really got interested in just the nuts and bolts of why Jews are hated and into defending Israel. I got very interested in Alan Dershowitz. I have a lot of his books. I think I listened to his book, The Case for Peace, the audiobook, many, 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 many times, probably 30 times, or at least pieces of it, the most amusing bits. And
Mhm.
I really developed, I don't know, I think it's just my many morbid curiosities. I think anti-Semitism became one of my many morbid curiosities, but a chief one because it was personal, I suppose.
Right.
And I knew that the people spreading it had a particular kind of insane and really vile mental illness. And I feel like this whole monologue I'm doing is a bit of a tangent, but that's just kind of how I plopped here. But I think it's in its own way, it's a blessing. And then White Rose was an accident too. One of the things I did with Charles Jacobs is I helped him not in he did all the organizational work, but I just on a textual level, I helped him edit a little book which came out almost 2.5 years ago called Betrayal, The Failure of American Jewish Leadership, which was a great honor to do. And this is a collection of essays about why establishment American Jewish leadership just has not been up to the task of fighting anti-Semitism and protecting the community in a world where we have more threats than the perennial, slack-jawed, inbred neo-Nazis. They're still around, and they're still quite a bit of a problem, but there are more problems. There's communists, there's Islam, there's even Farrakhan. And the woman, my dear friend Karen Lerman Bloch, who runs White Rose, she published an issue of White Rose about the failure of Jewish leadership, which eventually became the book. And we got friendly, and things kind of sprang from there. So that's just me recounting the history there. And we recently published an issue of White Rose, which was about Islam. And we had a lot of tough conversations because, as I've heard in the past, not painting people with a broad brush is important, the phrase you always hear. And we made the decision that we just had to deal with, it's a rather rabbinic way to look at it, we had to deal with what the text of Islam said. And
Right.
that's what you see on the website right now. And
Mhm.
that's what I'm here to talk about as far as I recall.
Well, it's interesting, you talk about how things fell into place or something was lucky or coincidence. And, I think maybe a little bit about me. I'm a person of deep faith, and I don't believe that anything happens by accident, and that God, who
Mhm.
I believe in, puts all of those pieces into place and brings us into situations where that He has already prepared us for, and then helps us to achieve and accomplish those things. And so I just throw that in there because, when you believe in God, an awful lot of coincidences happen. Maybe that's a good way to put it, or seeming coincidences. But I want to know more about the magazine. Like, first of all, who are Sophie and Hans Scholl exactly, and how does that get us to where we are today with White Rose?
It's a wonderful question. So, Sophie and Hans Scholl, they were, in modern parlance, they were just kids in college at the University of Munich, I believe it was. And they were Christians, and they were relatively typical teenagers for the time, but they weren't on the outside, but they were very devout Christians, and they understood something which is a little more obscure than it should be, though it's not simple. Nazism and Christianity are not the same thing. I hope I don't make anybody uncomfortable when I say that it's just historically a fact that Christian anti Semitism was a very, very necessary condition for Nazism existing in the first place. But it doesn't mean that they're the same thing. And these bunch of kids recognized that. And they understood that, just also as a small tangent, the Nazi leadership hated Christianity because, rather ironically, given what Christian anti Semites have been saying for all those centuries, they believed it to be basically a form of Judaism and very, very detrimental to the European soul, and this goes back to into the even back to the late 18th century, and you get this in um, the Germanic Enlightenment, people like Kant, people like Fichte, Fliess, these various German philosophers, idealist philosophers who birthed German nationalism as a form of revolution. By the way, it's not just this fogey thing, very hot, and unfortunately, by the standards of the day, sometimes liberal people were very into this stuff, which comes up in Nietzsche about Judaism and Jewish ideas being a block to the force for life, kind of the libido of the human spirit. And the Nazis believed in that fully. But these kids in college, instead of doing what they were told, they decided to create an underground movement, which I suppose you'd call it an underground press, which printed pamphlets, which talked about the difference between Nazism and Christianity in broad terms, and opposed Nazism when it was absolutely illegal to do so. And didn't all happen at the same time, but everybody in the group was executed, I believe. And Hans and Sophie, they were beheaded with a guillotine. Sophie's execution is actually depicted in Dinesh D'Souza's wonderful film Death of a Nation, where he talks about this in some detail, and there are beautiful reenactments and partially on location, actually. And my friend Karen was so moved by this that the Christian Zionism we see in the United States had a little bit of an analog in Nazi Germany of any kind, where you had Christians who were disgusted by the Holocaust. Now, obviously, I don't think Sophie knew every single detail of what was going on at Treblinka and Auschwitz and so on. But the Jews certainly weren't there anymore, and they had to go somewhere. And nobody was very sad that they disappeared. And these brave kids who were unrecognizable to American college kids today, because it's pretty rare to find an American college student, if I may say, stereotypically, who has the courage to do something righteous and then be beheaded for it. It's usually these days calling for, in whatever way, for Jews to be beheaded and then not suffering at all. And if you do, you whine and cry about it because you don't want free speech for anyone else, but for you, it's very sacred. And so Karen started White Rose about 4.5 odd years ago, or a little more. I think it was the winter of 2021, in the midst of COVID, when really nothing made sense. Nothing was from Earth. Everybody was saying stuff which didn't make any sense. And as far as I recall, the first issue was called Leftism versus Liberalism, where she wanted to make clear that totalitarianism and freedom aren't the same thing. Now, when I put it that way, it's pretty obvious. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But things get garbled in our culture. And you have people who really believe in very, very, very severe tyranny, claiming that they're liberals sometimes. And that's not okay. And so the magazine has been an attempt to kind of restore a rationality and just kind of a intellectual normality. To use a lot of boring adjectives, which just hasn't existed in political and journalistic discourse for quite a long time. Certainly, I don't know when this thing will be uploaded, but yesterday you had Charlie Kirk's memorial, a murder which disgusted all of us, and we're still emotionally recovering from it. And then you have a journalist, Tucker Carlson, getting up there, and he's trying to tie the murder of Charlie Kirk, whom some people have called a Christian martyr, to the crucifixion. And he directly makes a connection between the crucifixion, the murder of Jesus by the Jews, and tying into the insane, barely intelligible conspiracy theory that it was the Jews, that it was Israel who killed Charlie Kirk. And this guy's a journalist. This guy got famous by being Mr. Truth, who exposes narratives which don't make sense and exposes actual conspiracies. And, in this case, the only conspiracy, it seems, is from a obnoxious little peninsula hanging off of the Arabian Peninsula called Qatar, and all the excess oil money they have, which they spend on jihad and buying people without morals like him. And when an idiot like that is a journalist, you got to do something about that. And I'm the furthest thing from a hero, I can assure you. But I'm trying to do anything to really look into things and try to see what the truth is. That's what journalism is supposed to be. And in the world we live, I mean, I'm sure we all toss and turn and lament over this. People have asked what is truth for a long time, and that's great. But when truth is something which is unintelligible and intangible and and you're really not even sure what it is in the sense of its definition, if you understand what I mean. That's very
Yeah.
scary.
Very scary.
That's
I
terrible.
agree. I agree. Well, that gives us some great background on the magazine and why it exists. And I confess to you, I did not know the story of Hans and Sophie. I usually try to ask questions I already know the answer to, but
Good
I've
player.
got to look into that. The Death of the Nation, Death of a Nation. That's the movie.
Yes, it came out 7 years ago in
Okay,
2018 by Susan.
I'm really gonna have to follow
Saw
up
it
on
in
that
theaters.
because yeah, yeah. Listen, we're very interested in your recent article in White Rose entitled Islam is Jihad. We're currently running sort of a frequently asked question podcast series, and I thought you could help us understand the history of Islam a little better and how jihad is connected to the events of October 7th. I have some personal experience with that. I've actually seen all of the body cam footage and the CCTV footage from that day. And we want to find out. We want to find out for the people who are listening who have concepts of their Muslim friends and the Muslim religion and so on, but don't understand this word jihad. Let's jump into it. What is jihad exactly, and where does it originate?
Okay, so unfortunately, the best way to answer that question is a rather linear fashion. So Islam is made up of three documents. The first one is the Quran, is right here. This is the record, supposedly, of the divine revelations from Allah to the angel Jibril, whom we call Gabriel, to Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. And then we have the Sirat Rasulullah. This is the sacred biography of Muhammad, the life of Muhammad. This is a rather unreadable translation from 1955. And this is the biography of Muhammad. It's what Muhammad did. Its historicity has been challenged, but an enormous majority of Muslims believe it's literally true. And then we have the hadith. These are the traditions. That's basically what hadith means. These are the traditions, which are narrations, and they are a record, supposedly, of what Muhammad did and what Muhammad said, and also the sayings and actions of his companions, of his friends, the people who followed him, his fellow warriors, basically. And this forms a corpus, which you could call a trilogy. And basically, all the important information about Islam is contained within these three groups of documents because the hadith are massive. There are many collections of a hadith. There are 6 main collections, at least in the Sunni tradition. The Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia follow that too. The copy of the Quran I just showed, this is printed by Darussalam. Darussalam is a state Saudi printing conglomerate. And so the reason why I laid this out is because the way to understand Islam, because Islam is very, very, very confusing for the average non-Muslim, understandably, it's the story of Muhammad. You cannot understand Islam without Muhammad, just like you would say as a Christian, you can't understand Christianity without Jesus. And so this is why the biography of Muhammad, as unreadable as this translation is, it is so important because the Quran is really hard to read for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it's a discombobulated collection of sayings and admonitions. It's nothing like Tanakh. It's nothing like the Bible, which is in context. It's you read it and it's in a sequence. This is discombobulated collections of stuff. So you're able to put it all into context with the Sirat Rasulullah, with the biography. And what you get is the story of a guy who was a warlord. And even more than that, he spent 12 or 13 years in his birthplace of Mecca, preaching theology, preaching religion. And he gathered something like 150 people as followers. He didn't do that great. It was not a huge place, but 150 odd people is not a massive slice of the population. And he got into trouble, and he was, and the pagan Arabs there didn't like what he was saying because he was making exclusivist claims, and they wanted to keep things peaceful and keep trade flowing, and he eventually got angry and he was insulting their gods. And so he left for a number of reasons. I don't want to go into all that. But the beginning of the Islamic calendar is in the Christian calendar, the year 622. And that's the year of the Hijrah. When he goes up north, he leaves Mecca and goes up north to a place called Yathrib, which today is called Medina. Medina and Medinat in Hebrew are basically the same word. It means city, polity, and basically means the city of Muhammad, pretty much. And Medina basically means, because it became his city, his base of operations. 622 is the beginning of the period when Muhammad decided to switch his tactic, I guess you could say, from just preaching religion to jihad. Jihad properly means struggle, and I have a very interesting thing here, which I obtained. This is a rather popular book in the Muslim world and the Arab world, and struggle in German, Kampf, means the same thing as it does in Arabic, jihad. And also, just by the way, the only part of the world in which this jerk is a hero is in the Muslim world. And that's just a fact. That is a fact. I'm sure you remember the very shocking incident not very long after October 7th, when the IDF was first going into Gaza, and they were in a building because they were looking for weapons, and they happened to stroll into, I think it was the bedroom of a young teenage girl, because I'm sure there are weapons in the bedroom, which is a very common thing there. And they saw an iPad on the night table or the dresser, and one of the soldiers clicked the lock screen. And guess who was on the lock screen of this little 13, 14-year-old girl who should have had someone silly like Taylor Swift? It was this guy.
Wow.
So that tells you something about what goes on in the Muslim world, and also the fruits of jihad. So Muhammad, just to return, that was, I think, a necessary tangent. Muhammad changed his tactic to warfare, and he spent the remaining decade of his life or so engaging in acts of prolonged physical violence. The lowest estimate from the biography of Muhammad is that I believe he engaged in personally 61 acts of jihad over the course of those 10 or so years. So that's, if you break that out, that's something like one act of jihad every few months. I don't want to get into the exact math here and look like an idiot because I'm not good at it, but that's basically how it averages out. So that's a lot of jihad. And he engaged in caravan raids, and that was a big deal because caravans were the economic lifeblood of the peninsula. And what you do is you would invest. There weren't a lot of coins floating around, but you'd invest a rug or or something in a caravan, and then you'd hope that when your friends came home with stuff from wherever they were trading, they'd have something which is worth more than that, and you could trade that for food, or they come back with food. It was this is late antiquities. People are poor by modern standards, and so if you rob a caravan, interestingly enough, there are a lot of non-combatants who have nothing to do with your war who are going to die and possibly even starve to death. So that's a pretty nasty thing. Just as a little detail there. And so he also became very upset with the Jews, because he was counting on the Jews, who were literate, unlike him, to prove that he was a prophet. in the Judaic sense. He was the final prophet, as he's called, seal of the prophets. But they probably were rolling on the ground laughing at him because he would get things wrong and because he didn't know very much about Tanakh. There are a lot of errata. There's a verse, I forget exactly which one, where he confuses Miriam, the sister of Moses, with Mary, the virgin, which prophets typically refrain from doing, as you might imagine. And so he was very angry at the Jews, and he embarked on jihad against the Jews. And he killed a lot of them. And at one point, he killed between 600 to 900 of them, when they very understandably allied with his enemies because they didn't want to get murdered and have all their stuff stolen, which he was doing. In fact, a couple of tribes, he did exactly what Eichmann did. He expelled them, and he stole everything they had. The only way you can leave is if I take everything you own, which is exactly what Adolf Eichmann did in Austria for the Jews who wanted to leave. And so this is how Muhammad became successful, is how Muhammad became rich. And the Quran's very, very, very clear that jihad is a part of the program of Islam, and that the success of Islam as a religion depends on it. I can read you a couple of verses. Here's one, which is very important. This is 933. I'll read it to you. It is he who has sent his messenger, Muhammad, with guidance and the religion of truth, Islam, to make it superior over all religions, even though the mushrikun, the polytheists, pagans, idolaters, disbelievers in the oneness of Allah, hate it. Superior. That means that Islam has to be supreme over the whole globe. It's a very subtle way of seeing it. But there's also another very interesting verse here. This is 33:21. Indeed, the messenger of Allah, Muhammad, you have a good example to follow for him who hopes for the meeting with Allah on the last day and remembers Allah much. What that is understood to mean in classical Islamic jurisprudence is that Muhammad, who was a warrior, who was a jihadist, he is the perfect example of moral conduct for every Muslim and, of course, for all humanity. And this is a man who waged wars of aggression against people he didn't like and who disagreed with him. This is a man who had sex with a 9-year-old girl. I'm just going to put it very, very, very bluntly, unfortunately. He had a friend named Abu Bakr, who was a very important companion, and he became the first of the Rashidun, the rightly guided ones, the first caliph of the post-Muhammad period. The Shia would disagree. The Shia who run Iran, they disagree with that, but he had a little daughter named Aisha, and you make marriage alliances in the pre-modern world, and so he wanted to strengthen his position with Muhammad, and so he married Muhammad to his little daughter, who was 6, but Aisha had some kind of disease, I don't know what it was, and her hair fell out, and so it was shameful for her to be seen by a man for 3 years, where she was having this problem, and then it got better when she was 9, and she married Muhammad in a physical sense at 9, and she became his favorite wife. This is very clear from various Islamic writings, and he would say things like, this is quoted in the Hadith, that revelations do not come to me when I am in the garment of anyone other than Aisha. He actually would wear his little wife's clothing. I don't know what it was. I don't think it was a nightie, but it was something like that. And he would prefer to stay with her as opposed to the other wives he had between 9 and 11 at one time, when Muslim men are only allowed up to 4. And so this is who Muhammad was. I just give you a very, very small snippet of what he did. And so, and this is all a tangent, but I think it's necessary just to give context here. And I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but jihad is the struggle to make Islam supreme over all religions. Now, after 9/11, there was this very understandable, because if the truth is horrible, we don't want to believe it, to make jihad sound nice. There was a very, very vile mini-series on CNN by a woman called Christiane Amanpour, who has major problems with the Jews. and also major problems with the truth. And it was called God's Warriors. And in the section on Islam, she interviewed a woman whose name escapes me. And she made it very clear that Islam was, that jihad had nothing to do with violence, nothing to do with destroying non-Muslim civilization by any means, because there's such thing as non-violent jihad. And I'll go into that in a second. And he said, oh, jihad is violent. Who made that up? And who made that up is a direct quote. And so the greater jihad became prominent. Jihad is just the struggle to get to the gym. You read phrases like this in the various literatures. Right? And none of this is consistent with what the Islamic texts say. And there's statistical analysis. I won't go into all that. It's all very complicated and pedantic, if you ask me. Jihad is central to Islam. And the reason why I mentioned Muhammad only becoming successful when he embraced jihad, Islam is only successful if it embraces jihad. You know when Islam isn't successful? When it's beaten militarily and its countries are colonized, which happened in the late 19th century by the British and the French. And I think one way to look at phrases like, moderate or radical Islam, and I really do believe this, that these are optical illusions which are created by us, created by the history of European colonialism. Because when in this sort of, because we're living in a funny age. Islam has not been a global, very, imperial force with an actual, Khalifa, an actual caliphate, an actual empire in a formal sense, officially since 1924. Since the official, it was really 1923, and of course it lost the war in 1918, but the official end of the Ottoman Empire. That's a long time. That's 101 years. And at that time, we still had European colonialism, and Islam was really squooshed beneath these empires. I think that's a good word to use. You had the flavor of these of Islam there, but it just wasn't politically powerful. Obviously you had you had European countries and their oil interests. That's true, but it wasn't any worse than that. Even by 2001, you're like, what? Islam is that? Everybody knew Islam was violent in 17th century, 18th century. My goodness, before that, everyone knew that. But the British and the French, by colonizing the area, had squashed it down. So by the time we get to 9/11 and later, it's very shocking that Islam is violent because it had been politically and militarily supine.
Hmm.
And then in the 20th century, you have very secular movements, socialism, theism, even communism sometimes, and these kind of filled the void to a certain extent. There's always an Islamic flavor, and Assad wasn't really devout, but he certainly was, operating within that flavor, certainly of all Islamic prejudices. But the Muslim world wasn't really, really, really powerful until 1979. The Islamic Revolution in Iran is the big, big, big turning point where you have an actual Sharia Islamic state, which, unlike Saudi Arabia, doesn't have this funny tango with the West, fully, fully, fully committed to what the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith say, what Quran 933 says. And also, you have verse 812. And in 812, it says something rather interesting. It says, remember when your Lord revealed to the angels, verily I am with you. So keep firm those who have believed, and I will cast terror into the hearts of those who have disbelieved. So strike them over the necks and smite all over their fingers and toes. That's where all the beheading comes from. And there are other verses too, which talk about it too. And also, interestingly enough, it's Hezbollah who taught the Mexican drug cartels to behead people, I believe sometimes with chainsaws. And so the Islamic world is undergoing a big change. It's rising again to a certain extent. when it was not really politically powerful in previous ages. And so jihad, I'm talking about this in a rather disorganized way just as it comes to my mind. Jihad is something with which we're not familiar because history went in a more peaceful and stable direction, I guess you could say, with European colonialism, and that hit a lot of that.
Yeah, that's a lot to take in and to
Well, but
process, but
well,
it's super helpful to get that background. And I guess the question I want to ask right now is this, there is certainly evidence for violent jihad in the Quran. We've been discussing that. We know that in the past they've tried to dress it up and make it non-violent. Make it jihad is just it's the way that we work really hard to be better people. It's the way that we do all that we can to live peacefully among our neighbors. Exactly. And so tell me this, because you've read the text, you have them there in front of you. What evidence is there? What contradicting evidence is there in the Quran and in biography and the other document you mentioned? What evidence is in there that contradicts jihad being violent? Is there any?
well, actually, I haven't thrown this out. I have this pretty little flower pot here, but that's kind of what it's shaped like. There's nothing. There's nothing there. There are four different kinds of jihad. There's jihad of the sword, jihad as-sayf, it's called in Arabic, and we all know that. So that's 9/11, that's ISIS, that's Hamas. There's also jihad of speech, jihad of writing. These are fungible in the digital age, and these would come under the heading of taqiyya. Taqiyya is sacred deception. And there are a bunch of places in the Quran and certainly throughout the Hadith which allow Muslims to lie for the sake of advancing the cause of Islam.
Convenient.
It's usually worded in the sense of not swearing false, of being able to falsely swear an oath if you must in order to preserve your life. If non-Muslims are trying to kill you, like Muhammad's tribe was, the Quraysh. I'm trying to put this into the historical context. So Muhammad would tell his guys, if pagan Arabs surround you and they ask if you're a follower of mine, something like that, you can say, "Don't worry, I'm not followed Muhammad. I'm not a Muslim. I worship the gods just like you," something like that. And this rolls along and snowballs. And that's important. So speech and writing. And the last one is jihad of money. This is jihad fundraising. This is jihad money laundering. This is Qatar funding Hamas. This is CARE laundering money for Hamas. This is all this kind of thing. So did you notice there are three kinds of jihad which aren't violent. No physical violence is needed whatsoever.
Right. But what is the end goal of those three kinds of jihad that are not violent? I would ask that.
So the first two I mentioned, that's deception and manipulation. And then the fourth, money, that can be a form of manipulation because you can buy people, like Tucker Carlson. You can buy people, unfortunately, like people in the administration, whom I certainly do not believe are anti-Semites or even necessarily bad people, into believing that Qatar is an ally when they are exactly, from a Sunni point of view, they're the same as Iran. Qatar isn't as shabby as Tehran, but is dreary. It's more glittery and gold. And I suppose when they want to buy you, they dump you in a jacuzzi and with the Amir and everything's fun. It's all a form of deception because it distracts you from the violence. But the violence is always hanging above you, like the concept of a suspended sentence. There's this big prison sentence suspended over you so you don't misbehave and when you're on probation. And it's kind of like that. Now, I will say, of course, and I've said this before, that very large amount of Muslims, certainly in the West, particularly in America, probably don't know anything about this. And even if they say that jihad isn't violent, they may even mean it. Because unlike in Judaism, there isn't this value, there isn't this fundamental pillar of educating people in their religion very, very, very thoroughly. I met an ex-Muslim woman a few years ago who, wonderful, beautiful woman from Pakistan. I think she's from Pakistan, and she actually became Jewish. And she said, I noticed when I was going to synagogue, when I was going to shul, they have a Torah portion, and there's nothing like that in the mosque. You get you have the prayers, and you get a sermon, which usually is vile, and that's about it. If you really, really want to study, you can, and you're encouraged to. But there's no general base level of knowledge which buoys you up and is textual and is serious in Islam. That's not required. Also, illiteracy is very high in the Muslim world. And so I just will say that in all fairness,
Yeah.
that if you meet a nice Muslim, as you put it, the person actually may be a perfectly good, nice person. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on flesh and blood human beings. That's not why we're here. As I've said before, racial objections to immigration are not earthly. It's not terrestrial logic. It's not appropriate. It's not morally acceptable. It's not morally tenable for lots and lots and lots of different reasons. And I mean, certainly one thing I love about white supremacists who are all smarter than us is they haven't researched the least obscure moments of European history in which you have extremely pasty people exterminating each other for reasons which have nothing to do with them looking different. The Wars of the Roses is a wonderful example where everybody was white and everybody was Catholic and everybody spoke English and everybody drank the same booze and they were massacring each other for a very academic reason of succession to the throne. But jihad is violent, and the texts back that up. And I think that's just the easiest way to say it.
Yeah, and so to I guess talk about that just a little bit more. We don't want to paint with the broad stroke like you mentioned earlier, that there are sort of moderate Muslims who probably don't fully understand the tenets of their faith, right? They don't understand what really Islam is all about and what jihad really is. And I think, I can say, like, from a perspective of a Christian believer who follows the teachings of Jesus, for example, we had a bunch of Christian people in the past who also didn't fully understand what the true tenets of faith in Christianity is, and who did horrible things in the name of Christianity. So that's sort of a flip of what we're talking about with jihad. But Christians are supposed to love their neighbor. They're supposed to care for one another. They're supposed to follow the teachings of Jesus the way that he taught them. And many Christians in the past, sadly, have done the opposite. And so I guess I'm making a bit of a comparison there, but on the opposite side of the coin. We're always careful about this, but I was a pastor for a number of years, and so we used to, talk about Christians that what we called C&E Christians, right? Christian and Easter. The only time they ever showed up was on the special days, and they didn't really allow sort of Christianity to impact their day-to-day life. And in the same way, I think there's a lot of Muslims out there who, they're just not, if they were totally dialed into and sold out to what the Muslim religion was all about, they would understand that jihad is violent and so on. Am I going too far there, or I just wanted to sort of frame it that way?
What you said is great, and it kicks off a lot of things for me. So the great scholar of Islam, Bill Warner, who's retired now for some health issues he's had, one thing he said is, "I'm not a Muslimologist," something to this nature. The only Muslim I care about is Muhammad. And you were talking about making comparisons. One thing Muhammad said in a hadith, I don't remember the exact one, but the number, but the one thing he said is that the way he'd like to die is, I would like to die in battle. I would like to be martyred. And then he says, it's basically quoting word for word, I'd like to come back to life again and then get martyred. Then come back to life again and then get martyred. and come back to life again and then get martyred. So somebody who wishes to live and die by the sword, to reap what he sows. Reaping swords is probably not as tasty as reaping wheat or something else. That is quite a comparison there for you. Muhammad is the pattern of conduct, as I read to you from Quran 33:21. And so, in a certain way, that kind of removes the onus. It's Muhammad's fault. It's a problem about Muhammad. And so basically it's not everybody, whose skin makes them look like they're from Arabia or from Pakistan is evil. That's not what's going on. It's nothing to do with that. It's just don't behave like Muhammad. This reminds me. I'm not a massive fan of him, though he is good on Islam. Many many years ago, I think it was in 2003. It was not very long after the war in Iraq began. Bill Maher was on some show, and he did a set, and he was talking about how people say, oh, you're prejudiced against Islam or you're prejudiced against Muslims. And he said something like, well, we forget what prejudice means. It means prejudge. And when it comes to Islam or Arab culture or whatever it was, Iraqi culture, I don't know what the context was. I haven't watched it for years. I'm not prejudging. I'm judging. And there's body of evidence you can examine, which isn't written by anybody alive today. Just what I've outlined here with these texts here. Obviously, there are imams and sheikhs and people you can check, and dawa guys who were probably some of the most repulsive in their personal conduct. So a lot of scandals have broken recently. But this is a problem of the past, which unfortunately lives on in the present. And I'm not blaming flesh and blood people for anything other than their own individual actions. So, and I'm not casting dispersions on broad human populations based upon labels or what they look like or anything. And so, but in comparing the Christian message to the Islamic one, as you just did as a pastor, I think just that, excuse me, I forget which gospel it is, but just the verse about reaping what you sow based upon the violence you have committed in your own life is very, very important to remember. Because if you treat other human beings with brutality and violence, then in some fashion that's going to come back to you. Is that not what's happening to Hamas? We're on a show about Israel, and for some reason we haven't talked about Israel. That's what's going on here, and that's the only thing which is going on here.
Yeah.
And people say, well, oh my God, we feel sorry for the poor Palestinians. And to say that they started, I think, is a little too prosaic, because to say they started it doesn't really talk about the problem. I guess that's a way you can talk. I guess you can say that, because the problem is this verse here, 2:191, and I'll read it to you. Brace yourself, because this is going to get entertaining. And kill them wherever you find them, and turn them out from where they have turned you out. And al-fitna, that means strife, is worse than killing. And fight not with them at al-masjid al-haram, the sanctuary at Mecca, which also is al-haram, can refer to the Temple Mount as well, unless they first fight you there. But if they attack you, then kill them. Such is the recompense of the disbelievers. So what I just read to you there, basically the first sentence, that's what the whole issue about Israel is about.
Right.
So Islam conquered the area in the 7th century. At that time, in 637, it was ruled by the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't ruled by the Jews. And also, ironically, the Byzantines had banned Jews from living in Jerusalem. And so the Muslims conquered this. But during the time of Muhammad, Muslims were fighting with the non-Muslim Arabs, and Muslims would lose ground a little bit on a couple of occasions. And so this verse has to do with when the pagan Arabs drive you out of somewhere, you got to kill them and take the territory back. And so in classical Islamic jurisprudence, drive them out from where they drove you out, and I'll also kill them wherever you find them, which is rather important part because it's the first sentence. The first phrase means that all land conquered in the name of Allah, in the name of Islam, throughout history, must remain the property of the Muslim Ummah. Ummah means the community of believers, is this borderless Islamic empire forever. And so Jewish conduct doesn't really matter, actually. The land is the property of Islam, and so it must be recaptured for Islam, no matter what, no matter how long it takes, no matter how many Muslims die, how they die, or if they don't die, it's Pallywood, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, with media fakes,
Definitely.
faked pictures, malnutrition is not always malnutrition when you look at medical records. And so that, interestingly enough, I think it's an interesting illustration in the fabric of history and of current history, I guess you could call it, of reaping what you sow, when what you sow is pretty terrible and come at the expense of the lives of
Yeah.
innocent people
Yeah.
who are just caught in a theological abstraction about how a little piece of land, which has historically belonged to other people, actually, is yours because of just this verse, which is quite any morally objective person would say is morally objectionable. Kill them wherever you find them. What the hell is that about?
Right. No,
Who
exactly.
kills people wherever they?
Yeah. Well, this has been, I think, extremely enlightening, and I've learned some things. I hope that people listening have learned some things, and I think, Ben, that we have other conversations we need to have because I feel like we've just sort of scratched the surface here with regard to jihad and what all of that means. We haven't really even talked about October 7th, which, when I spoke with Charles Jacobs about his understanding of jihad and sort of Muslim conflict, October 7th was classic jihad violence. That
It was
yeah,
about that verse I just said. So I did kind of talk about it.
yeah,
That's why it's happening.
yeah.
Just that verse.
Well, and I mentioned to you earlier that I did go even against my own good judgment and watched the 45 minutes of body cam footage and CCTV footage of October 7th. And in those 45 minutes, I think I counted in excess of 40 exclamations of Allah Akbar, which told me something about the October 7th attack. It told me that it was about more than just, oppression or not, having the things they wanted to have or whatever. This was faith driven. It was religious and it was jihad. And so you made a comment earlier about the fact that, Hamas started it, and maybe that's not a sort of a big enough reason for this conflict to carry on these almost 2 years now. However, Hamas didn't just start it that day. This was and is something that's been part of the objective for, I would say, many years, decades, hundreds of years even, in terms of jihad and wanting the area of Palestine, what we now call Israel, free of Jews. From the river to the sea, we know is not just a fancy slogan, it's geographical reality. And so all of these things, I hope, help people understand as we're talking that this is not it's not a simple war, and yet in many ways it's very simple. That Hamas is diabolically evil, and until Hamas is thoroughly dealt with, Israel can't continue to exist the way that it has existed the last, 78 years or wherever we're at right now. I don't know if you want to comment on that before we finish, but these are a lot of the thoughts that we're talking about and trying to help people understand is that there's an evil that needs to be dealt with here. And until it is, the
The
problem doesn't
comment
go
I'd make
away.
as quickly as I can is that jihad is a war against all the world of non-Islam. And the Iranians say, America and Israel are the great Satan and the little Satan. The way they word it, which is interesting. Also, there are these two pillars at Mecca at which you throw rocks on the Hajj, and that's the big Satan and little Satan. But it's kind of like a pyramid almost, to a certain extent. The Jews are the top of the pyramid of the non-Islamic world to be destroyed. The Jews are the most important, and I say that not because I'm Jewish or because I'm, have a Jewish, narcissism or something. It's because it's what the Islamic texts say. There's the famous hadith in Sahih Muslim, which is another collection. It's not the collection I showed you with my book. That's Sahih al-Bukhari. And there's the famous slogan you will see, the famous thing you will see from imams and everybody, that the hour, the end of days will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, and all the Jews hide behind rocks and trees, and the trees will develop the power of speech and yell out, "Ya Muslim, Ya Abdullah, there's a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." Except for the gharhad tree, which is the tree of the Jews. Botanists aren't quite sure what the gharhad tree is, or even if it exists. So the Jews are the most important to destroy in the Islamic mind. But October 7th is a massacre which happened to the Jews then, but it's happening in various ways all over the world. And one of the places where it is happening the most commonly is in Africa. Nigeria is the most stark example, really, I guess you could say, where it happens basically daily. You have Christians who are surprised early in the morning or at other times of the day by Muslims, by terrorists. Churches are burned down. People are chopped to death. Clergy very often are the targets. They're killed. Very often people are burned alive within their churches. Young girls are dragged off into slavery. There's a girl called Leah Sharibu who's still a slave. She was kidnapped on February 19th, 2018, along with more than 100 of her classmates. She was at a boarding school. And they were all released because they either converted to Islam or they're Muslim already, but she refused to convert to Islam, and she's a Christian. And she was forcibly married to a Boko Haram degenerate, and she's thought to have 2 children by him, and she's still a slave today. So October 7th is basically, if you want to call it like the Hebrew name for a global disease. And it's a disease very much of Africa, of sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the initiatives in which I was involved with Charles Jacobs is the African Jewish Alliance. This is a major, major, major thing because it shows the equivalency between different victims of jihad, different groups of victims. And no 2 sufferings are the same, but sometimes the source is. And one way to fight this in an ideological and political and nonviolent way is to bring together different groups of victims of jihad and to have them see the equivalence of the source of their pain and the source of their abuse and denigration and oppression, and to join together as an infidels alliance, I suppose you could call it, and really make clear that this isn't just something the Jews are whining about or something. This is happening to people all across the globe. And if we're not careful, this is going to happen here.
Yeah.
And so people whining about, oh, the Jews, the Jews, and we're Americans, we're Christian, this or that or whatever. I don't know what people are talking about when they say things like that because they rarely know what they mean anyway. But this is a threat to the entire world. And it's not just Jews or Africans or Hindus or Zoroastrians who are going to be oppressed by this. It's everybody else. It's everybody. And so when Israel fights Iran or fights Hamas or fights anybody, they're fighting your war for you. It's the other way around. It's not we're dying for Israel, which is kind of impossible because it'll take quite a catastrophe for there to be a draft come back. Israel's fighting for us. And I think that's the way we should end it, I suppose.
And I'm in total and complete agreement with you on that. I've said it before. They are the tip of the spear in terms of this war on jihad. And if we don't back what is happening there, doesn't mean we have to sort of carte blanche approve everything the Israeli government does. But we do want to support the good side of this conflict. And in my mind, it's as clear as day when I watch the footage from October 7th, and I've also seen some of what's happening in Africa. We just had a report, I think 3-4 days ago about a funeral that was attacked. Over 100 Christians were killed in Nigeria, again, just that recently. When I see these things, I understand. There's an evil side and there's a good side. And the good side, even though they're not always, perfect, they're still battling for what's good and what's just and what's right. And we, I think, should maybe leave it there. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. And I've learned a lot. I hope people listening have learned a lot. And I do hope we get this opportunity
Thank you
again.
very much. Good to talk to you.